Hey friends, gather close. Tonight, Moat want to tell you about an old mountain man named Elias and a tiny, shivering shadow in the snow that changed his quiet world forever. Picture it with me, the heavy, blinding snow swirling through the pines, the amber glow of a solitary porch light cutting through the dark, and there, barely audible over the howling wind, a cracked mule. You hold up your lantern, and two tiny, frightened eyes catch the light. You probably would have walked right past her. Most people did. If a story like this softens your heart, take a quiet moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely love what we share here at Wild Hearts. We'd also love to know where you are watching from tonight. And tell us in the comments the name of an animal that once changed your life. So pour yourself something warm, find your softest blanket, and let the world go quiet. This is a story worth hearing slowly. The winter that brought the little wildcat to Elias's door was one of the cruelest the Northern Ridge had ever seen. Elias was 72 years old, a man carved from the same weathered cedar and silent granite as the mountain itself. He lived alone in a hand-built cabin at the end of a twisting, rutted logging road that the county snowplows had long ago forgotten. His days were measured not by clocks or calendars, but by the stack of chopped firewood on the porch and the slow, inevitable creep of shadows across the valley floor. He liked the quiet. He told himself he needed the quiet. But sometimes, when the wind died down and the snow fell thick and heavy, the silence in his cabin felt less like peace and more like an empty room waiting for a voice. It was a Tuesday evening in late January when the storm broke. The sky had turned the color of a bruised plum by 3:00, and by dusk, the wind was shrieking through the tops of the ancient ponderosa pines. Elias sat in his worn leather armchair by the cast-iron stove, listening to the wood pop and sizzle, nursing a mug of black coffee. The fire was burning faster than he anticipated, eating through his evening supply. With a heavy sigh and a groan of stiff knees, he layered up. And yet, else, he pulled his thickest wool coat from the peg by the door, jammed his hands into leather work gloves, and pushed the heavy oak door open against the gale. The cold hit him like a physical blow. It was the kind of bitter, biting freeze that snatches the breath right out of your lungs and makes your eyes water instantly. He pulled his collar up, grabbed his kerosene lantern from its hook, and stepped out onto the porch. The pale yellow light flickered, casting long, dancing shadows over the waist-high drifts. He carefully navigated the stairs, mentally noting the loose third step that he always meant to fix come against the western woodpile, leaning against the western side of the cabin. He was just reaching for a heavy split log of birch when he heard it. It wasn't a howl, and it wasn't the wind snapping a branch. It was a sound so fragile, so incredibly thin, that Elias almost convinced himself it was a trick of the storm. He paused, holding his breath, standing perfectly still with a log suspended in his gloved hands. Mew. A cracked, raspy sound, swallowed instantly by the roaring wind. Elias dropped the wood. It landed with a muted thud in the snow. He lifted the lantern higher, sweeping its warm, golden halo over the blinding white landscape, and yet it comes from nowhere else. The smell of dry pine smoke from his chimney mixed with the sharp metallic tang of ozone and impending ice. filling his nose as he strained his eyes into the dark. He followed the sound back toward the front of the cabin. There, just beneath the overhang of the lowest porch timber, where the wind had carved a hollowed-out bowl in a snowdrift, was a shadow. It was no larger than a discarded winter mitten. Elias sank to his knees, ignoring the icy dampness instantly seeping through his thick denim trousers. He held the lantern out. Huddled in the shallow depression of the snow was a bobcat kitten. She was impossibly small, thinned to almost nothing, her mottled gray and tawny fur plastered to her delicate ribs with frozen sleet, and yet it comes from nowhere else. She was trembling so violently that her entire tiny body shook with the effort, and her left front paw was tucked awkwardly beneath her chest, as if she were favoring it. When Elias reached out a massive leather-clad hand, he fully expected her to shrink away or scramble into the dark. Instead, she offered the most unexpected defense. She didn't cower. She planted her 3 good paws, flattened her oversized, black tufted ears against her skull, puffed out her tiny chest to look as big as possible, and let out a completely silent hiss. It was a fierce, brave little show of defiance from a creature roughly the size of a pine cone. Elias couldn't help but let out a soft, rusty chuckle. She was a tiny warrior, ready to take on a giant, even as the cold was putting her to sleep. He knelt there in the swirling snow, the lantern light reflecting in her wide, panicked, amber eyes. Elias felt a sudden, profound ache in his chest. He had stopped believing the wild things would stay, and yet, looking at this fierce, fating spark of life, he knew he could leave her. The mountain took what it wanted. It always had. But tonight, Elias decided, it wouldn't take her, not on his watch. Slowly, deliberately, he pulled off his right glove with his teeth. He wanted her to feel the warmth of his skin before she felt the strength of his hands. He reached out again, moving slower than the falling snow, and gently cupped his bare, calloused hand over her trembling back. It comes from nowhere else. She flinched for a fraction of a second, her silent hiss fading, and then, overwhelmed by the sudden heat of his palm, she simply collapsed against his fingers. Elias unbuttoned the top half of his wool coat. With infinite care, he scooped her up. She weighed practically nothing, a handful of brittle bones and fading adrenaline. He tucked her gently inside his coat, against his thick flannel shirt, directly over his beating heart. And yet, it comes from nowhere else. He buttoned the coat back up, shielding her completely from the biting wind. He stood, his joints being in protest, and abandoned the firewood. The storm raged behind him as he climbed the porch steps, stepping carefully over the broken third board. He pushed through the heavy oak door and slammed it shut against the winter night, plunging them both into the warm, smoky, quiet sanctuary of the cabin. And yet it comes from nowhere else. The wild had come to his doorstep, and as he felt the tiny rhythmic thumping of her heart against his ribs, Elias knew his quiet life was wonderfully over. Elias stood completely still in the center of the one-room cabin, letting the sudden, heavy silence of the indoors wash over him. Outside, the storm continued to hurl itself against the thick log walls, rattling the frosted window panes and howling over the broken third step of the porch. But in here, it comes from nowhere else. The world was reduced to the steady, comforting hiss of the cast-iron wood stove and the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. He didn't take off his snowy boots. he simply unbuttons from nowhere else. He simply unbuttoned his heavy wool coat with clumsy, trembling fingers, terrified he might accidentally crush the fragile life tucked against his chest. When he gently parted the thick fabric, the little bobcat hadn't moved from where she had collapsed against his flannel shirt. Her eyes were squeezed tightly shut, and her breathing was dangerously shallow, a rapid flutter beneath his ribs, as the ambient heat of the cabin began to chase the frost from her fur. The room filled with the distinct, earthy smell of wet wool, melting ice, and damp pine needles. Elias carefully scooped her into his massive hands. He felt entirely ridiculous, like an old grizzly bear trying to cradle a dandelion. As he lifted her, she didn't hiss. Instead, she let out a tiny, vibrating sound. Not a meow, but a high-pitched, staccato chirp that sounded exactly like a startled cricket, without openings. Without opening her eyes, she instinctively wriggled forward, shoving her freezing, wet nose directly into the crook of his elbow, seeking the deepest pocket of warmth she could find. A slow, quiet smile cracked across Elias' weathered face, pulling at the deep lines around his eyes. It was a strange sensation, he realized with a sudden pang that he hadn't smiled in days. Perhaps weeks. For 12 long winters, this cabin on the ridge had been a fortress of absolute solitude. Ever since he had retired to the mountain, he had worn his isolations like a heavy, comfortable quilt. The quiet was safe. It didn't ask anything of him, but there were nights, especially when the snow buried the roads and the valley below disappeared into white nothingness, when the quiet transformed into a physical weight. He would sit in his leather armchair, listening to the logs settle into ash, settling ash, feeling a deep, hollow ache in his chest, the ache of a man who had entirely run out of things to care for. He carried the tiny, chirping bundle over to the small kitchen area, holding her against his body with his left arm while he rummaged through the cupboards with his right. He felt a sudden surge of mild panic, followed by a wave of gentle humor at his own expense. What on earth did a retired logger feed a nearly frozen apex predator? His pantry was a monument to bachelor survival. Tins of baked beans, venison jerky, a half-empty sack of flour, and coffee. Then, tucked behind a jar of pickled beets he had been avoiding since last autumn, he spotted salvation. It was an old tin of powdered goat's milk he kept on hand for emergencies. Well, little warrior, Elias rasped, the sound of his own voice startling him in the quiet room. It sounded gravelly and rough from disuse, like two dry stones rubbing together. He cleared his throat, feeling a foolish blush creep up his neck, even though there was another human soul for 20 miles. Let's see if we can get something warm in your belly. Seems we re out of fresh mice. He set the old iron kettle on the hottest part of the stove to boil water. With one hand, he retrieved his favorite chipped blue enamel mug from the drying rack. It had a white rim and a dent on the side from where he had dropped it on the granite hearth 3 years ago, using his thumb to pop the lid. Off the tin, he clumsily scooped a spoonful of the white powder into the mug, pouring in a splash of warm water from a thermos to mix it into a thick paste before the kettle even finished heating. While the water came to a boil, Elias moved to his armchair. He dragged a sturdy wooden apple crate from the corner, tipped it on its side, facing the radiant heat of the wood stove, and lined it with the softest thing he owned, a thick, faded flannel blanket that he usually draped over his knees on bitter nights. He lowered the kitten into the makeshift nest. As soon as his hands pulled away, the loss of his body heat made her shiver violently. She curled herself into an impossibly tight ball, tucking her nose under her good front paw, her oversized, black, tufted ears twitching nervously at the crackle of the fire. Elias stood back and just watched her for a long moment. In the warm, golden light of the fire, he could see the beautiful, intricate tapestry of her coat. Even starved and soaked, the dark spots against the pale, tawny fur were striking. He noticed the white spots on the backs of her ears, designed to look like eyes to ward off predators from behind. She was a creature of the wild, born to ghost through the timber and hunt beneath the moon. Yet here she was, reduced to a shivering speck in an apple crate. He walked back to the kitchen, poured the steaming water into the chipped enamel mug, and stirred the milk until it was smooth and blood-warm. He tested a drop on the inside of his wrist, just as he remembered his mother doing when he was a boy. The smell of the warm milk filled the small space, sweet and comforting, completely chasing away the bitter metallic scent of the winter storm. Elias looked at his kept no reflection in the darkened glass of the window above the sink. He saw a man with wild gray hair, a tangled beard, and shoulders stooped by time and gravity. But for the first time in 12 years, the eyes looking back at him didn't look empty. They looked purposeful. He had stopped believing the wild things would stay, that life had any new chapters left to offer an old man hiding in a mountain. Yet, as he listened to the tiny, rhythmic chirps coming from the apple crate by the fire, Elias realized the mountain hadn't just sent a storm tonight. It had sent him a reason to wake up tomorrow. Elias stood in the center of the kitchen, the chipped enamel mug radiating a comforting heat against his palms. He had the milk, but as he looked down at the apple crate, a very practical problem presented itself. The little Bobcat's mouth was barely the size of a thimble. She certainly couldn't lap from a bowl, let alone a mug. He set the warm milk on the counter and padded heavily in his thick wool socks toward the small washroom at the back of the cabin. Inside a battered cedar medicine cabinet, past tins of drawing salve and old bandages, he found what he was looking for. A small glass dropper assembly from a long empty bottle of eardrops. He brought it to the kitchen sink, boiling it clean with leftover water from the iron kettle. It was a fragile thing of glass and black rubber, looking comically tiny, clutched in his thick, scarred fingers. Fingers that had spent a lifetime wielding chainsaws and felling massive timber. He couldn't help but smile at the absurdity of it all. Here he was, a tough old mountain hermit, preparing to play wet nurse with a piece of medical glass. He drew up a measure of the warm, pale milk into the glass tube. Carrying the dropper and the chipped mug, he carefully lowered himself onto the braided rug beside the apple crate. His knees protested with a familiar chorus of pops and creaks, a sound that usually made the local wildlife scatter. But the exhausted kitten only twitched one oversized, black tufted ear. She was pressed as far back into the corner of the crate as she could manage, a trembling pile of damp fluff blending into the red and black squares of the flannel blanket. Her amber eyes were wide, tracking his every microscopic movement with terrified intensity. "Easy now," Elias whispered, keeping his voice to that low, gravelly hum. He rested his heavy forearms on his knees, ensuring his posture was as small and unthreatening as a man of his size could manage. "Mort brought you something better than the cold." He didn't reach for her. Instead, he slowly extended his hand, holding the dropper. Resting his knuckles on the edge of the blanket, he squeezed the rubber bulb just enough to let a single creamy drop of warm milk bead at the tip of the glass. The sweet, earthy scent of the goat's milk drifted into the warm space between them, mingling with the dry heat of the wood stove and the faint smell of wet pine clinging to her fur. For a long, agonizing minute, nothing happened. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked heavily, marking time against the muffled howling of the storm outside. Elias kept his hand perfectly still, ignoring the cramping in his forearm. He had learned long ago from watching the forest that trust could never be forced. It could only be invited. Finally, the kitten's tiny pink nose quivered. She stretched her neck forward, just a fraction of an inch, her body remaining coiled and ready to flee. She took a cautious sniff of the air, then another. The aroma of the warm milk was too powerful an instinct to ignore for a starving creature. Slowly, painfully slowly, she crept forward, her injured left paw hovering just above the flannel. When she was close enough, she didn't bite the dropper. Instead, she leaned forward and gingerly licked the single drop of milk off the glass tip with a tongue, the size and texture of a small pink rose petal. Elias held his breath. The kitten froze, her eyes widening as the warm, rich liquid hit her tongue. In the blink of an eye, her terror vanished, replaced entirely by desperate hunger. She lunged forward, grabbing the glass dropper with both front paws, her tiny, needle-sharp claws completely wrapping around Elias's thick index finger. She didn't just drink. She attacked the dropper, latching onto the glass with a frantic, rhythmic suction. And then came the noise. It wasn't the cricket chirp from earlier. As she drank, she began to vibrate, emitting a fierce, gargling purr growl that sounded exactly like a tiny, flooded, two-stroke engine struggling to start. It was an impossibly loud sound for such a small body, echoing in the quiet cabin. Elias chuckled, a deep, rumbling sound in his chest. "Slows down, little warrior, you look like choke yourself." He gently depressed the rubber bulb, pacing the flow of the milk so she wouldn't swallow too much air. She drank wildcat, hot, her eyes squeezed tightly shut in pure bliss, her ears pinned back in concentration. Her tiny claws dug lightly into his skin, not in aggression, but in a desperate, instinctive need to hold on to this sudden source of life. Elias didn't pull away. The tiny pinpricks of pain were grounded, real, and strangely wonderful. He looked at his own massive, weathered hand. He looked at a hand that had spent years callousing itself against the world, and marveled at how gently it could hold the fragile glass, how perfectly still it remained, while a wild thing anchored herself to it. Halfway through the second dropper full, she abruptly pulled off the glass, sneezed a spectacular spray of milk droplets directly into Elias's gray beard, and let out a single, demanding chirp. Elias wiped his chin with his flannel sleeve, unable to stop a broad smile from breaking across his face. "Excuse me," he said softly. Moat, suppose that means you want more. He refilled the dropper from the chipped mug and offered it again. This time, she didn't hesitate. She latched back on, the flooded engine purr starting up immediately. He fed her until her tiny belly was tight and round beneath the damp fur, until her frantic pulls on the dropper slowed into lazy, sleepy laps. When she finally pulled away for good, her head bobbed with exhaustion. She didn't retreat to the back of the crate. Instead, she let her chin drop heavily onto Elias' massive thumb, which was still resting on the flannel. She let out one last, soft sigh that smelled entirely of warm goat-s milk, and within seconds, her breathing deepened into the steady, rhythmic cadence of deep sleep. Elias didn't move. He knelt on the hard floorboards for a long time, the cold draft seeping through his thick wool socks, entirely captivated by the weight of her chin on his thumb. He had stopped believing the wild things would stay, that he had any softness left in him. But looking at the milky white mustache drying on her tiny chin and feeling the steady, thumping warmth of her heartbeat through his skin, he realized something profound. Trust wasn't a sudden gift. It was a bridge built drop by drop, breath by breath. And tonight, over a chipped enamel mug and a medicine dropper, the first planks of that bridge had been laid. By the time the gray, bruised light of dawn finally crept through the frosted window panes, the fragile truce of the apple crate had vanished. The milk-induced coma had worn off, and with waking came the terrifying realization of her surroundings. Elias had dozed off in his armchair. He woke with a start to the sound of a frantic scrabble of tiny claws on the pine floorboards. He opened his eyes just in time to see a blur of tawny fur and oversized ears scramble frantically across the room and wedge itself into the darkest, most inaccessible corner of the cabin. The 2-inch gap beneath his massive heirloom pine dresser. Elias groaned, a sound that harmonized perfectly with the settling timbers of the snow-laden roof. He lowered himself onto his hands and knees, feeling every one of his 72 years in the sharp protest of his joints. Pressing his weathered cheek against the cold, drafty floorboards, he peered into the gloom. The smell of old wood wax, decades of undisturbed dust, and the sharp, biting tang of the winter draft filled his nose. Deep in the absolute shadows, 2 glowing amber orbs stared back at him. She let out another silent hiss, her tiny pink mouth open wide in a fierce, desperate display of bravado. "Back to square one, are we?" he murmured softly, resting his heavy chin on his forearms. He didn't reach for her. His hands, though they had handled chainsaws and felled heavy timber, were too large, too foreign. A force he knew from a lifetime of watching the woods that a cornered animal was a terrified animal, and reaching into the dark would erase whatever small fragments of trust they had built over the chipped enamel mug. He had spent 12 winters fortifying this cabin against the world, building walls of routine and silence to keep the ache of loneliness at bay. It was a strange, poetic irony, he thought, that he was now trying to dismantle those invisible walls for a fierce creature, roughly the size of a pine cone. Patience was the only currency the wild respected. The next 48 hours became a quiet, sleepless battle of wills. The little Bobcat absolutely refused to leave her dusty sanctuary while Elias was upright and moving. But the space beneath, The heavy pine dresser rested directly against the uninsulated outer wall of the cabin, and Elias knew the bitter draft seeping through the log chinking would eventually steal whatever strength the warm milk had given her. She needed the radiant, life-saving heat of the cast iron wood stove. So, Elias went to work. He hobbled to his linen trunk and dragged out every spare blanket he owned: heavy wool camp blankets, frayed patchwork quilts, and the soft flannel from the apple crate. Moving with deliberate, agonizing slowness, he draped them over his footstool, the seat of his armchair, and a short stack of firewood, constructing a low, dark, meandering tunnel that stretched from the edge of the pine dresser all the way across the floorboards to the warm hearth. It looked exactly like a child's makeshift blanket fort, utterly ridiculous and beautifully out of place in the austere, solitary cabin of an old mountain man. When evening fell and the wind began to howl around the eaves once more, Elias prepared his tools. He filled the glass medicine dropper, kepite hat, warm goat's milk, and sat cross-legged on the braided rug at the end of the blanket tunnel. The dry heat from the cast-iron stove baked his aching shoulders, providing a comforting counterpoint to the icy chill radiating from the floor. He tapped the glass dropper gently against the floorboards. Tap, tap. Dinner time, little warrior, he coaxed, keeping his voice to a low, steady, gravelly rumble. For a long time, the only answer was the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Then, a tiny paw, completely black at the pads, slid out from beneath the dark edge of the dresser. It hovered in the air for a second, but instead of stepping forward, the paw suddenly lashed out, aggressively swatting at a floating dust mote that had drifted, confused that she was holding light. She caught it, seemed deeply confused that she was holding nothing, shook her paw indignantly, and immediately retreated back into the shadows. Elias pressed his lips tightly together to keep from laughing out loud and scaring her again. She was terrified of him, but apparently the dust bunnies of the mountain were fair game. "Focus," he whispered fondly. He squeezed a single drop of milk onto the floorboards just inside the entrance of the blanket tunnel. The sweet, rich scent drifted down the dark, woolen corridor. Another 10 minutes passed. The old iron kettle hissed a quiet song on the stove. Finally, he heard it. The incredibly soft, hesitant pad-pad scrape of her approach. She was favoring her injured left paw again, moving entirely within the protective shadows of the draped quilts. She navigated the tunnel an inch at a time, pausing every few seconds to sniff the wool and listen for danger. Elias stayed perfectly, impossibly still. His legs were falling asleep, a swarm of stinging pins and needles creeping up his calves, but he didn't dare shift his weight. At last, a pair of oversized, black tufted ears poked out from beneath the final draped blanket. Her amber eyes darted frantically from the chipped mug on the floor to Elias' face, then down to the glass dropper resting in his hand. The memory of the warm milk finally won out over her deep-seated instinct to flee. She crept the final few inches into the warm, golden light of the fire, letting out a sharp, demanding cricket chirp. Elias slowly lowered the dropper. She didn't to latch on quite as fiercely as the first night, but her hunger was undeniable. As she drank, the flooded engine purr started up again, vibrating fiercely through the fragile glass and directly into Elias's fingertips. He watched the firelight dance across her beautifully spotted coat, noticing, for the first time, a tiny notch missing from her right ear, a permanent mark of some early, unseen struggle in the wild before she had found his porch. When she finished the dropper, she didn't bolt back to the freezing drafts of the pine dresser. Instead, she took 2 careful steps backward, retreating just inside the protective cover of the blanket fort. She turned around a few times, instinctively nesting in the folds of a faded quilt, and sank down with her nose pointing out toward Elias, the radiant heat of the stove wrapped securely around her makeshift cave. Elias carefully set the dropper back in the mug. He leaned his heavy head against the leg of his armchair, utterly exhausted, his back aching fiercely and his legs entirely numb. But as he sat there in the dim light, listening to the faint, sleepy purr echoing from within the tunnel of blankets, the heavy, suffocating silence in his cabin for 12 long years, felt wonderfully, completely broken. The wild heart was still incredibly cautious, but tonight she had chosen to stay in the light. By the middle of February, the bitter mountain winter had locked the ridge in a fortress of ice, but inside the cabin, the temperature had fundamentally changed. The little wildcat was growing fast. The delicate, trembling creature that had fit inside the pocket of Elias's wool coat was lengthening into a lanky, long-legged juvenile. Her injured left paw had completely healed, and she navigated the one-room cabin with a fluid, silent grace that constantly astonished him. The blanket fort by the wood stove was still her primary sanctuary, but she spent more and more of her time observing him from its fringes, her amber eyes tracking his slow, deliberate movements with intense curiosity. It was a quiet Thursday evening, the kind where the snow falls so heavily it muffles even the sound of the wind. Elias sat in his worn leather armchair, a kerosene lantern at his elbow, engaged in the familiar winter ritual of waterproofing his heavy logging boots. The small cabin was thick with the comforting, earthy aroma of melting beeswax, pungent saddle soap, and the ever-present dry heat of the pine logs crackling in the stove. He worked slowly, rubbing the golden paste into the deep scuffs and creases of the thick leather with a rag, his mind drifting back through the 12 solitary winters he had spent staring into this very fire. He was so lost in thought that he didn't hear her approach. He only noticed she was there when the heavy, rawhide lace of the left boot, which was dangling over the edge of his knee and brushing the floorboards, suddenly jerked. Elias froze, his calloused thumb suspended halfway across the toe of the boot. He glanced down, moving only his eyes. Just at the edge of the braided rug, half hidden in the shadows of the armchair, the bobcat was currently locked in a life-or-death struggle with the leather shoelace. She had flattened her body entirely to the floor, her overside ears pinned flat beneath the little notch on her right ear. Her stubby tail gave 3 rapid, involuntary twitches, and her hindquarters did a hilarious, exaggerated wiggle before she pounced. She launched herself forward, trapping the dangling lace between her 2 front paws, biting down on the tough rawhide. With a fierce, muffled growl, she pulled back, trying to drag her prize away. her black padded toes slipping comically on the smooth pine floorboards. Elias bit the inside of his cheek, fighting back a rumbling chuckle that he knew would send her scrambling back to the safety of the pine dresser. He relaxed his grip on the boot, letting the lace give a little, playing along with the fierce tug of war. It was a delicate dance. He was a man accustomed to hauling timber, trying to modulate his strength to match a creature that still weighed less than a sack of flour. After a few minutes of spirited battle, she seemed to realize the leather snake was inextricably attached to the giant mountain man. She stopped pulling and released the lace from her teeth, giving it one final, disdainful swat with her paw. She sat back on her haunches, her chest heaving slightly, and looked directly up at Elias. He held his breath. Usually, this was the moment the spell broke. Whenever she remembered how large he was, or whenever he made a sudden movement to reach for the chipped enamel mug on the side table, she would retreat. But tonight, she didn't bolt. Instead, she took a cautious step forward, stepping out of the shadows and fully into the warm pool of lantern light. She approached his foot, which was resting heavily on the floorboards, clad in a thick, gray woolen sock. She leaned in, her pink nose twitching rapidly, as she investigated the scent of the beeswax and saddle soap, mingled with the familiar smell of wood smoke and the man who had fed her warm milk from a glass dropper. Elias remained perfectly still, the rag forgotten in his hand. He watched the firelight trace the beautiful dark spots along her tawny spine. She sniffed the sturdy rubber sole of the boot he had just finished oiling, which sat upright on the floor next to his socked foot. She investigated the heavy brass eyelets and the thick leather tongue. Then, to Elias, a profound astonishment, she didn't just walk away. She stepped directly over the thick toe of his winter boot, circling tightly once, twice, 3 times, kneading the stiff, oiled leather wildcat hat, her front paws, as if it were a soft down pillow, with a heavy from nowhere else. With a heavy, dramatic sigh that sounded entirely too big for her body, she collapsed. She draped her lanky form across the bridge of the heavy boot, completely abandoning her guard. And then, the final beautiful surrender. She let her chin drop, resting the full weight of her head directly against Elias' ankle. The sudden, unexpected pressure sent a shockwave of warmth straight up Elias' leg and directly into his chest. It was such a small, simple point of contact, yet it felt heavier and more significant than any giant redwood he had ever felled. Almost immediately, the rhythmic, flooded engine vibration of her purr started up, humming through the thick woolen sock and directly against his skin. Elias slowly, painstakingly, leaned back into the worn leather of his armchair. He closed his eyes, overwhelmed by a sudden, stinging moisture gathering beneath his eyelids. For 12 years, those heavy winter boots had carried him across miles of empty snow, over frozen ridges and silent valleys, always returning to an empty cabin. They had been the heavy, plodding anchors of a man walking out the rest of his days in profound isolation. But tonight, anchored beneath the soft, trusting weight of a wild heart, those boots felt remarkably different. He listened to the steady, rumbling purr vibrating against his ankle, harmonizing beautifully with the crackle of the wood stove and the distant howl of the mountain wind. and yet it comes from nowhere else. He didn't dare move to reach for his coffee. He wouldn't disturb her for all the gold in the earth. The mountain had spent a decade slowly hardening Elias into stone. But as he sat there in the amber light, entirely immobilized by the fragile trust of a sleeping bobcat, he felt the very last of the ice around his heart completely shatter. March arrived on the mountain not with a sudden thaw, but with a fragile, pale sunlight that pierced the frosted window panes for a few fleeting hours each morning. The bitter cold still clung to the log walls, but the light itself carried a faint, distant promise of spring. Inside the cabin, life had settled into a wonderfully strange new rhythm. The terrified, shivering speck that had once hidden beneath the heavy pine dresser was gone, replaced by a lanky, confident juvenile with oversized paws and a deep, abiding curiosity about every single item Elias owned. Elias. It was a Tuesday morning, crisp and shockingly bright. Elias stood in the small kitchen area, the familiar, comforting aroma of dark roasted coffee wafting from the old iron kettle on the wood stove. He poured the steaming liquid into his chipped blue enamel mug, enjoying the heavy, radiating warmth against his calloused palms. He took a slow sip, his eyes scanning the cabin as he toured the heavy pine dresser to gather his clothes for the day. Prus. He pulled open the bottom drawer, which always stuck a little on the left side, and reached in to grab a pair of his thick, gray woolen winter socks. He pulled out one sock. It was a right foot, worn slightly thin at the heel. He reached in again. Another right foot. He frowned, his thick gray eyebrows knitting together in confusion. He pulled out a third sock, examining the familiar curve of the toe seam. A right foot. Elias stood there, holding identical right socks, feeling a profound sense of bewilderment. He was a man of absolute, unchanging routine. For 12 years, he had done his laundry in the old tin tub every Sunday evening, hanging his clothes by the fire, and meticulously folding his socks in matching pairs. He systematically checked the floor around the dresser. He checked the woven laundry basket in the corner. He even checked inside his heavy logging boots. Nothing. The left socks had simply vanished into thin air. A sudden, rhythmic thumping sound broke his concentration. Dihi. Elias turned slowly, his chipped mug in hand. The sound was coming from the center of the room, near the blanket fort that had now become a permanent architectural feature of the cabin. Pasas, pasas. The morning sun had crested the distant ridge, sending a sharp, golden rectangle of light, spilling directly across the braided rug and illuminating the entrance of the makeshift woolen tunnel. Suspended in that brilliant shaft of sunlight were thousands of tiny, swirling dust motes, dancing lazily in the gentle thermal draft of the wood stove. And standing right in the middle of this glowing, floating galaxy was the wildcat. She was completely entranced. She sat back on her powerful hind legs, her tawny coat glowing like spun copper in the sun, the tiny notch in her right ear clearly silhouetted against the bright window. She was engaged in a delicate, incredibly serious ballet. She would watch a single dust mote drift downward, her amber eyes tracking it with the intense, predatory focus of a seasoned hunter stalking a snowshoe hare. Then, with a sudden, lightning-fast swipe of her paw, she would snatch at the empty air. Elias watched, biting the inside of his cheek to suppress a smile. She caught nothing, of course, but after every swipe, she would bring her paw down, carefully inspect her black pads, and look profoundly confused as to how her massive prey had escaped. Then she would spot another floating speck and the hunt would begin all over again. But it was the dust mote hunting that caught Elias' attention as he stepped closer. It was what she was sitting on. There, woven meticulously into the folds of the frayed patchwork quilt at the edge of the blanket fort, was a dragon's hoard of thick gray wool. One by one, Elias counted them. 5 woolen socks, all left feet. He let out a low, gravelly chuckle that vibrated deep in his chest. The mystery unraveled perfectly in his mind. Every evening when he came inside from chopping wood or checking the perimeter, he would sit in his leather armchair. Because of a stiff right knee, he always crossed his left leg over first, pulled off the heavy logging boot, and tossed the heavy logging boot, and tossed the left sock onto the braided rug before wrestling with the right. The little wildcat, it seemed, had been quietly observing this nightly ritual from the shadows. To her, the left sock was a discarded prize, a daily offering left exclusively for her taking. So, Elias murmured softly, taking a sip from the chipped mug. "You a thief, are you?" The bobcat froze mid-swipe. She dropped her paw and turned to look at him, her oversized ears swiveling forward. She didn't look guilty in the slightest. Instead, she let out a short, demanding cricket chirp, as if asking why he was interrupting her very important morning work. Elias crouched down slowly, his joints popping, and set his coffee mugs on the floorboards. He reached out a weathered hand toward the nest of stolen laundry, intending to reclaim at least one left sock so he could put his boots on. The moment his fingers brushed the wool, she moved. She didn't hiss, and her claws remained sheathed, but she firmly planted her 2 front paws directly over the pile. She lowered her chin onto the socks, fixed him with an unblinking amber stare, and burner, and started up that fierce flooded engine purr. It was a clear, unmistakable declaration of ownership. Mine. Elias left his hand resting near hers for a long moment, feeling the warmth of the sunbeam and the vibration of her purr humming through the floorboards. And yet it comes from nowhere else. He looked at the ridiculous pile of mismatched laundry, the draped blankets of the fort, and the chewed rawhide lace dangling from his boot nearby. For 12 solitary winters, this cabin had been immaculate. It had been a museum of perfectly ordered loneliness, where everything remained exactly where Elias put it, because there was no one else to move it. The silence had been pristine, and the floors had been completely clear. Now, his home was a mess. His routines were disrupted. His belongings were being held hostage by a stubborn, purring predator, and his quiet mornings were interrupted by the frantic chasing of invisible dust. Elias slowly withdrew his hand, sacrificing the sock to its new, rightful owner. He sat back on the cold floorboards, letting the golden sunlight warm his face, and felt a deep, overwhelming wave of gratitude wash over him. He looked at the beautiful, spotted creature, guarding her woolen treasure, and realized he wouldn't trade this chaotic, messy, wonderfully lived-in cabin for all the pristine silence in the world. He was an old mountain man who had finally lost his left socks, but in the process, he had found his heart completely whole again. By the time late April arrived, The bitter freeze had finally broken, surrendering to the slow, weeping thaw of the mountain spring. The heavy fortress of snow that had buried the cabin for months began to shrink, filling the quiet morning air with the constant musical drip of melting ice sliding from the eaves onto the softening earth below. Inside the one-room cabin, the seasons were changing too. The wildcat had grown substantially. She was no longer the fragile, shivering speck of winter, nor the lanky, uncoordinated juvenile of March. She was filling out into a remarkably sturdy, muscular creature with thick, tawny fur, beautifully pronounced black spots, and heavy, powerful paws designed for silently navigating the rugged timberline. Yet, despite her increasingly formidable appearance, she acted less like Aspect's predator and entirely like an old maness, devoted, spotted shadow. The mornings always began exactly the same way. The moment Elias's feet hit the cold pine floorboards beside his cot, he would feel the soft, sudden brush of thick fur against his calves. She no longer slept barricaded in the blanket fort by the heavy pine dresser. Instead, she had claimed the woven rag rug beside his bed, waiting patiently in the pre-dawn gloom for the precise second he stirred. As Elias shuffled toward the kitchen area in his thick wool socks, still wearing two mismatched right feet, having long ago conceded the left ones to her growing horde, she matched him step for step. It was a delicate, often comical navigation. If Elias took a step to the left toward the wash basin, the bobcat would immediately dart to his left, her shoulder pressing firmly against his shin. If he stopped abruptly, she would invariably bump right into the back of his knees, letting out a short, indignant cricket chirp as if his sudden braking was a tremendous personal insult. "Mind your paws, little warrior." Elias would grumble softly, catching his balance on the edge of the kitchen counter after nearly tripping over her for the third time before sunrise. "You've got the whole mountain to walk on, and you insist on standing exactly where my boots need to go. And yet it comes from nowhere else." She would simply sit down right on his foot, wrapping her stubby tail around her toes, completely unbothered by his gentle scolding. The true anchor of their shared mornings, however, was the coffee. Elias would strike a wooden match against the iron stove, the sharp, sulfurous tang cutting through the sleepy air, followed quickly by the earthy, rich aroma of dark roasted beans as he spooned them into the filter, and yet it comes from nowhere else. Throughout this entire process, the bobcat would sit on the edge of the braided rug, her amber eyes tracking his every movement with the intensity of a supervisor. She waited patiently for the singular sound that signaled the start of the day, the distinct metallic clink of his favorite chipped blue enamel mug being set onto the granite hearth. The moment the mug touched down, the morning ritual officially began. Elias would lower himself heavily into his worn leather armchair, groaning as his stiff knees popped. Before he could even settle his weight, the bobcat would low Ia-pay effortlessly onto the wide, padded armrest beside him. She didn't want the coffee, but she absolutely insisted on being part of the ceremony. She would lean her large head forward, her tufted ears swiveling, and lower her pink nose right to the rim of the steaming mug. She would take one long, deliberate sniff of the bitter, oily steam, aggressively wrinkle her nose, and let out a dramatic, full-body sneeze that usually sent a fine mist of droplets over Elias's knuckles. Elias would softly chuckle, a deep rumble that vibrated through the leather chair. "Moat tell you every morning it's not for you, but you never believe me." But the routine wasn't over. After her sneeze, Elias was required to pay the toll. If he attempted to lift the chipped mug to his lips before she was ready, a heavy, black, padded paw, claws strictly sheathed, would reach out and firmly press down on the rim of the cup, gently forcing it back to his knee. She would then tilt her head, exposing the soft, white fur at the base of her ear, right below the tiny notch she carried from the wild. Elias would sigh in mock defeat. "My apologies. I forgot my manners." He would set the mug down, bringing his large, calloused hand up to gently rub the thick fur behind her ears. The moment his thumb made contact, the fierce, flooded engine purr would ignite, vibrating through the armrest and echoing warmly in the quiet cabin. And yet it comes from nowhere else. Only a full minute of dedicated scratching would she finally withdraw her paw, tuck her front legs beneath her chest into a perfect loaf, and graciously allow him to drink his coffee. Elias would sit there for hours as the sun climbed higher, sipping his warm drink, his left hand resting idly on the rising and falling expanse of her spotted back. The cabin smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and the sweet, musky scent of wild fur, and yet it comes from nowhere else. It was in these incredibly quiet, tender moments that Elias found himself reflecting on the absolute impossibility of their bond. He had spent his whole life watching the woods. He knew that bobcats were, by their very nature, solitary ghosts. They did not form packs. They did not seek out company or comfort. They moved through the world alone, relying only on their own silence and teeth to survive. Yet, here was this magnificent, wild creature, fully capable of surviving on her own now, actively demanding to be part of a mundane human morning. She wasn't trapped here. The snow was melting, and the door was often left ajar during the warmer afternoons. But she never strayed further than the broken third step of the porch. She chose to stay. She chose the scent of coffee, the scratch behind the ears, and the clumsy company of an old man with bad knees. Elias took another slow sip from the chipped blue mug, feeling a profound, quiet joy settle deep into his bones. For 12 years, his mornings had been empty rituals, designed purely to pass the time until the sun went down again. He had been a ghost, haunting his own life. But sitting here, anchored to the present moment by the heavy, purring warmth of the wildcat beside him, Elias realized the profound truth of his new existence. He was no longer just waiting out his winters. Thanks to a stubborn, spotted shadow, he was finally awake. By late May, the mountain had entirely shed its white winter armor. The air no longer smelled of sterile ice and wood smoke. Instead, it was thick with the intoxicating, loamy perfume of damp earth, thawing pine needles, and the sweet, green promise of budding fireweed. The rushing sound of snowmelt, swelling the valley creeks, replaced the howling winter gales. And as the world outside the cabin woke up, a deep, ancient instinct began to stir within the wildcat. She was magnificent now. The lanky, uncoordinated juvenile had vanished, replaced by a creature of breathtaking, muscular grace. Her tawny coat was thick and lustrous, the dark spots stark and beautiful against the lighter fur. But with her physical maturity came a palpable restlessness that seemed to vibrate right through the pine floorboards of the quiet cabin. The morning still began with the familiar coffee ritual, but her attention was fractured. When Elias set his chipped, blue enamel mug onto the granite hearth, she would still hop onto the armrest of the worn leather armchair, and she still demanded her toll of ear scratches. But the moment his hand retreated, she didn't settle into her perfect, purring loaf. Instead, she would climb higher, perching herself precariously on the very top edge of the chair's backrest, her powerful hind legs tucked tightly beneath her. From this elevated vantage point, she had an unobstructed view out the large front window, directly toward the distant timber-covered ridgeline, and there she would stay. For hours on end, she became a spotted statue. The warm spring breeze, carrying the rich, musky scent of awakening wildlife, drifted through the cracked window pane. She would press her pink nose as close to the wire mesh screen as she could get, taking deep, shuddering breaths. Sometimes she would open her mouth slightly, her jaw vibrating in a strange, silent chatter as she literally tasted the pheromones riding on the wind. Her oversized ears, particularly the right one with its tiny, jagged notch, were constantly swiveling, picking up distant frequencies of the forest that Elias couldn't even begin to fathom. Her quirky behaviors shifted, morphing from indoor mischief into something entirely different. She seemed desperately trying to reconcile the warm, safe world of the cabin with the intoxicating call of the mountain. One afternoon, Elias had left the heavy oak door propped open to air out the room. He was sitting on his cot, reading an old paperback, when he felt a sudden, damp thud on his right knee. He lowered his book. There, resting on his thigh, was a perfectly intact, terribly muddy pine cone. The Bobcat sat on the braided rug, looking incredibly proud of herself, her stubby tail giving a single, satisfied twitch. Elias let out a low, gravelly chuckle, picking up the damp offering. "Well, thank you, little warrior. Mort, suppose this is a step up from stealing my left socks." Over the next week, her little hoard by the heavy pine dresser, which still contained a ridiculous number of mismatched gray socks, began to resemble a forest floor. She brought in a dry twig, a small rock covered in bright green lichen, and, on one particularly ambitious morning, a very large, incredibly dead beetle. She would carefully place these items amidst the wool, arranging them with intense concentration, as if trying to build a tiny indoor forest to satisfy the wild ache blooming in her chest. Elias played along, always warmly thanking her for the gifts, even the beetle. But beneath the gentle humor, a heavy, quiet sorrow was beginning to pool in his heart. He noticed the pacing at night. When the moon was full, casting long, silver shadows across the cabin floor, he would wake to the soft, rhythmic pad scrape of her heavy paws. She would walk from the foot of his cot to the heavy oak door, press her nose against the bottom draft sweep, and let out a low, mournful sound that was entirely different from her usual cricket chirp. It was a guttural, drawn-out hum, a song for the trees, meant for ears other than his. Then, as if suddenly remembering where she was, she would turn, trot back across the room, and aggressively push her head under Elias S., dangling hand, seeking the familiar comfort of his calloused fingers. She was visibly torn, her heart suspended precariously between two worlds. One evening, as the sun began to dip behind the peaks, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of bruised plum and gold, Elias sat on the porch. He was perched carefully on the top step, avoiding the broken third board below. He had brought out a piece of dried venison jerky, hoping to tempt her outside to enjoy the evening air. She stepped delicately out the door, the fading light catching the golden fire in her amber eyes. She took the jerky gently from his fingers, giving it a polite, perfunctory chew before swallowing it. But she didn't sit down beside him, and yet it comes from nowhere else. She walked to the very edge of the porch, staring out into the darkening timber. She stood perfectly still, one paw slightly raised, leaning forward as if listening to a voice Elias couldn't hear. Elias watched the cool evening breeze ruffle the thick fur on her powerful shoulders. He leaned his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped tightly together, and felt the sudden, stinking prickle of tears behind his eyes. He had known this day would come. He had spent his entire life surrounded by nature, and he knew a fundamental truth. You cannot put a roof over the wind, and you cannot ask a wild thing to forget the forest. For months, she had been his shadow, filling the deafening silence of his life. Wildcat, hot purrs, stolen laundry, and profound, unconditional warmth. She had saved him from the fleeting isolation of his own making, just as surely as he had saved her from the snowdrift. But looking at her now, silhouetted against the vast, untamed ridgeline, Elias realized that holding on too tightly would be a betrayal of the very creature he had grown to love. He wanted her to stay. He selfishly, desperately wanted her to sleep on his boots and demand his coffee forever. But the wild was calling her blood, and the mountain always reclaimed its own. "It's all right, little warrior," he whispered into the twilight, his voice thick and rough, barely louder than the rustling pines. He didn't reach out to pet her, not wanting to tether her back to the porch. Mo'd hear it too. She turned her head slightly, her amber eyes meeting his in the gloom. She let out one soft, questioning chirp, then turned back to face the trees. The invisible tether between them was stretching tight, and Elias knew, with a quiet, devastating certainty, that it was only a matter of time before it snapped. The late May weather on the northern ridge was notoriously treacherous, capable of snapping from a balmy spring afternoon into a violent, freezing squall in the space of a single breath. It happened on a Thursday evening. The sky, which had been a soft, bruised plum at twilight, suddenly curdled into an angry, churning slate. The temperature plummeted 20 degrees in an hour, stripping the sweet scent of blooming fireweed from the air and replacing it with the sharp, metallic tang of ozone and impending ice. Inside the cabin, the sudden drop in barometric pressure acted like a physical electric current running through the wildcat. She did retreat to the blanket fort as she had during the winter blizzards. Instead, she became a creature of frantic, coiled energy, and yet it comes from nowhere else. She paced the length of the pine floorboards, her heavy paws making a rhythmic pad scrape that echoed ominously in the small room. Elias watched her from the kitchen area, feeling a deep, heavy ache settling into his stiff knees, a sure sign that the mountain was about to throw a tantrum. He watched, mildly amused despite his growing unease, as she marched over to her dragoness hoard. By the heavy pine dresser, she meticulously dug through the pile of stolen treasures until she found her absolute favorite item, a particularly thick, terribly frayed left woolen sock. She clamped her jaws gently around the heel, carrying it proudly as she resumed her pacing. It was a ridiculously endearing sight. This magnificent, muscular predator with the jagged notch in her right ear, aggressively stalking the perimeter of the cabin with a piece of gray laundry hanging from her mouth like a security blanket. "It's just a bit of wind, little warrior." Elias offered softly, striking a match against the iron stove to coax the embers back into a roaring fire. Nothing we haven't seen before. But as the first heavy, freezing drops of rain began to pelt the frosted window panes, sounding like handfuls of gravel thrown against the glass, her pacing abruptly stopped. She dropped the woolen sock directly in front of the heavy oak door, and yet it comes from nowhere else. She sat perfectly still, staring at the thick wood, her tufted ears swiveling frantically as she listened to the howling chaos outside. Elias realized with a sinking feeling that he hadn't brought in enough dry birch to outlast a sudden, freezing night. He pulled his thick wool coat from its peg and shoved his hands into his leather work gloves. "Stay back," he warned gently, turning the heavy iron handle. "Dante, let the draft catch you," and yet it comes from nowhere else. He opened the door just wide enough to slip his broad shoulders through. The squall hit him instantly, a blinding rush of freezing rain and wind that stole the breath from his lungs. Quemados. He stepped carefully over the broken third step, turning his back to the wind to grab 3 heavy logs from the top of the pile. It only took a few seconds. But when he turned back, the heavy oak door had caught a fierce gust of wind, blowing fully open against the interior log wall. And there, standing on the very edge of the porch, entirely exposed to the lashing elements, was the wildcat. Elias froze, the firewood heavy and awkward in his arms. "Hey now," he called out over the roar of the wind, his voice cracking slightly in his throat. "Get back inside. It's freezing out here." She didn't move. The freezing rain was already matting her thick, tawny coat, plastering it against her powerful muscles, just as the winter storm had done months ago. But she wasn't shivering. She stood tall, her head held high, her amber eyes reflecting the pale, erratic lightning that flashed over the distant ridgeline. She took a deep, shuddering breath of the chaotic, untamed air, her jaw chattering silently as she tasted the storm. She looked back over her shoulder at Elias. The warm, golden light from the cabin spilled out onto the porch, illuminating the space between them. For a long, heartbreaking moment, the two of them just looked at each other. Elias saw the profound pull of the mountain in her posture, the ancient, undeniable call of the wild vibrating in every muscle. She was fleeing in terror. She was answering a summons she could no longer ignore. She let out one final sound. It was the demanding chirp for coffee, and it was the fierce, flooded engine purr. It was a soft, low trill, a sound of acknowledgement, of profound gratitude, and of goodbye. Then, with a breathtaking, fluid grace, she leaped off the edge of the porch. She didn't bother with the stairs. She cleared the woodpile entirely, landing silently in the slick, wet brush. The blink of an eye. Her spotted coat blended perfectly with the shifting shadows of the timberline, and she was gone. Elias stood on the porch for a long time, ignoring the freezing rain soaking through his collar. He stared into the churning darkness, hoping against hope to see the reflection of her amber eyes one last time. But there was only the howling wind. Slowly, his joints aching kepi te had a sudden, profound exhaustion. He carried the logs inside. He pushed the heavy oak door shut against the squall, turning the iron latch with a heavy, final click. The cabin was warm. The fire crackled merrily in the cast iron stove. The grandfather clock ticked its steady rhythm in the corner. But the space felt entirely, devastatingly different. Elias walked past the empty blanket fort. He walked past the chipped, blue enamel mug sitting, unused, on the granite hearth. He stopped at the heavy oak door and looked down at the floorboards. There, perfectly centered on the braided rug, was the frayed, left woolen sock she had left behind. He picked it up, his massive, calloused thumb gently rubbing the worn gray wool. He sank heavily into his worn leather armchair, burying his bearded face in his hands. For 12 winters, Elias had lived in absolute silence, and it had never bothered him. He had worn his isolation like a comfortable suit of armor. But now, the silence was no longer a shield. It was a physical, crushing weight. The quiet of the cabin was deafening, ringing in his ears with the absence of her purr, the absence of her heavy paws on the floorboards, the absence of the wild heart that had miraculously chosen to beat alongside his own. And yet it comes from nowhere else. The mountain had given her to him when she was dying, and the mountain had taken her back when she was strong. He knew it was the natural order of things. He knew she belonged to the timber and the wind. But as Elias sat alone in the amber light, listening to the squall rage outside, he pressed the stolen woolen sock to his chest, realizing that sometimes the absolute hardest part of loving a wild thing is having the quiet courage to leave the door open. By early June, the violent spring squall had surrendered to a heavy, suffocating summer fog that crawled up from the valley floors, swallowing the mountain ridges in an ocean of gray dampness. Silent and entirely cloaked in mist, Elias didn't stay inside. For 7 days straight. The old logger pushed his weary, 72-year-old body through the thick, trackless timber of the northern slope. His knees burned with a steady, fierce fire, and his breathing came in ragged, shallow gasps as he navigated the wet granite shelves and slippery deadfall, but he simply refused to stop. And yet, it comes from nowhere else. He knew every deer trail and hidden ravine on this mountain, but searching for a bobcat was like chasing a ghost. They left no heavy tracks in the summer mud. They moved like smoke through the mountain laurel. Still, Elias carried a small canvas sack over his shoulder, and inside it was his favorite chipped blue enamel mug, filled to the brim with dried venison jerky. Every 100 yards, he would stop beneath the dripping canopy of the ancient ponderosa pines, lift his weathered chin, and let out a low, gravelly hum, followed by a sharp, clicking whistle. Warrior, he would call, his voice sounding thin and terribly fragile against the vast, muffled quiet of the fog. "Come on, little girl. Dinner's ready." The only answer was the steady, rhythmic drip, drip-drop of condensation falling from the pine needles onto his oilskin hat. He would wait, standing perfectly still until his fingers, kept numb from holding the canvas strap, his amber-flecked eyes desperately scanning the gray shadows for a familiar, notched right ear or the flash of a spotted coat. Nothing. The mountain was empty. By the 8th afternoon, Elias' strength finally failed him. He was a mile from the cabin, halfway up a steep shale screen, when a sudden blinding ache in his lower back forced him to his knees. He slid down the loose stone, his heavy leather gloves digging into the gravel to stop his descent, until his back hit the ancient trunk of a lightning-scarred cedar. He sat there in the wet dirt, his chest heaving, completely spent. The heavy fog wrapped around him, sealing him in an impossibly small, gray room of isolation, not to predators. For months, his mornings had been anchored by the wonderful, demanding presence of the wildcat. The sneeze over his coffee mug, the heavy weight of her chin resting on his winter boots, the ridiculous sight of her hunting, floating dust motes in the morning light. Now, as he sat alone in the damp woods, the memory of those moments felt like a cruel dream. Elias reached into his coat and pulled out the frayed gray woolen sock he had carried in his pocket since the night she vanished. He held the worn fabric in his massive, trembling hands, his thumb tracing the thin spot at the heel where her tiny claws had once dug in so fiercely during their games of tug-of-war. The absolute finality of her absence hit him with the force of a falling timber. He had spent 12 winters convincing himself that he didn't need anyone or anything, that the silence of the ridge was enough to sustain a man until his days ran out. But she had exposed the lie. She had broken the ice. She had broken the ice around his heart, forcing him to feel the fierce, terrifying joy of loving another living creature, only to leave him alone in the dark. A sudden, hot tear slipped down his weathered cheek, cutting a clean track through the gray dust and sweat on his skin. He didn't wipe it away. He leaned his heavy head back against the rough cedar bark, closed his eyes, and let out a ragged, trembling sigh that seemed to drag the last of his remaining hope right out of his chest. "Moot tried, little warrior," he whispered into the empty fog, his gravelly voice breaking completely, reduced to a raw, hollow rattle. "Moot tried to find you." He sat there for a long time, as the afternoon light began to bleed into the deep indigo of twilight. The fog grew thicker, colder, turning the surrounding pines into distorted, ghostly sentinels. Elias knew he had to get up. If he stayed on the damp ground much longer, his stiff joints would freeze entirely, leaving him stranded on the ridge. Trail. But as he looked down the long, empty trail leading back to his dark cabin, he realized he didn't have the strength to face the silence waiting for him behind the heavy oak door. And yet it comes from nowhere else. He had stopped believing the wild things would stay, and the mountain, true to its ancient, unyielding nature, had proved him right. He was just an old, lonely man sitting under a cedar tree, holding a stolen sock, waiting for the dark to take what was left. By the 3rd week of June, the heavy, suffocating fog had finally rolled off the peaks, chased away by a brilliant, fierce summer sun that turned the pine needles on the forest floor into a fragrant, golden carpet. And yet it comes from nowhere else. The mountain was alive with the buzzing of insects and the territorial songs of robins, but inside the cabin, The silence remained absolute. Elias had stopped searching the timber, and yet it comes from nowhere else. He had forced himself back into his old rigid routines, chopping wood until his shoulders screamed and scrubbing the pine floorboards until they shone. He even tried to put away the children's style blanket fort by the wood stove, but when he picked up the frayed patchwork quilt, he found a solitary, dry pine cone hidden in its folds. He had quietly laid the quilt back down, leaving the fort exactly where it was. It was a Friday evening, just as the sun was dipping beneath the jagged western ridge. The sky was a breathtaking canvas of bruised plum, amber, and deep orange, casting long, dramatic shadows across the yard. Elias sat on the front porch, perched carefully on the top stair to avoid the loose third step. He held his favorite chipped blue enamel mug in his palms, but it didn't contain coffee tonight. It was just plain, cold mountain water. He wasn't drinking. He was simply staring blankly at the line where the clearing met the dense, untamed timber, his mind a heavy, gray blank. It comes from nowhere else. A blue jay suddenly shrieked in the upper branches of an ancient ponderosa pine at the edge of the clearing. It was a sharp, alarmed sound that instantly shattered the evening quiet. Elias's hand tightened around the handle of the chipped mug. He didn't move his body, but his eyes narrowed, tracking the movement of the lower brush. The sweet, loamy scent of the evening forest air seemed to shift, carrying a faint, familiar musk that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Then, out from beneath the wide, sheltering fronds of a massive fern, a shadow stepped into the fading orange light. Elias held his breath, his heart striking a sudden, frantic rhythm against his ribs. The shape was large, moving with a fluid, silent grace that could only belong to one creature. As the animal stepped fully out of the brush and into the open yard, the brilliant, low-angled sunlight caught the thick, tawny fur of its coat, illuminating a beautiful pattern of dark, distinctive spots. It was the wildcat. She was magnificent, noticeably heavier and more muscular than she had been. 3 weeks ago, her chest broad and her powerful legs built for the rugged high country. But Elias didn't look at her size. His eyes locked instantly onto her head. There, swiveling forward to catch the sound of his ragged intake of breath, was her right ear. And in the center of the outer rim was the tiny, unmistakable, jagged notch. "Warrior," Elias whispered. The word was so thin, so entirely devoid of air, that it barely cleared his gray beard. The bobcat stopped dead in the center of the yard, about 20 feet from the porch stairs. She planted her heavy front paws on a patch of wild clover, her amber eyes locking onto Elias with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. She didn't approach. She stood perfectly still. Her stubby tail giving 2 rapid, involuntary twitches. The exact behavior she used to display right before pouncing on a dangling leather shoelace. For 2 long, agonizing minutes, neither of them moved. The grandfather clock inside the cabin ticked heavily, its muffled sound drifting through the open window, marking the space between the man and the wild heart. Elias felt a sudden, terrifying wave of doubt. She looked so wild now, so utterly detached from the creature that had once hoarded gray woolen socks. Her coat carried the rough, untamed smell of the deep timber and crushed shale, and yet it comes from nowhere else. He wondered if she had forgotten him, if she had simply wandered into the clearing by mistake, or if the invisible bridge they had built drop by drop over the winter had been completely washed away by the spring thaw. Elias knew he could. To force the moment, he slowly, deliberately lowered his calloused hands to his lap, keeping his posture small and unthreatening. He leaned his head slightly back against the porch railing and let out a low, gravelly hum, the exact, steady cadence he had used every morning over his coffee mug. The Bobcat's oversized ears instantly swiveled forward, flattening slightly. Her mouth opened just a fraction of an inch, her jaw vibrating in a brief, silent chatter. She took a tentative, hesitant step forward, favoring her left side for a split second, not from injury, but from pure caution. She walked 3 steps, stopped, sniffed the warm summer air, and looked back at the tree line as if checking her escape route. Then, she looked back at Elias, and her entire posture softened. She let out a sound. It was T, the wild, guttural trill of the storm, and it was T, a warning hiss. It was a sharp, high-pitched, unmistakable cricket chirp. Elias felt a sudden, stinging heat flood his eyes, blurring the golden yard into a smear of amber light. Before he could even blink the tears away, the bobcat broke into a trotting stride. She bounded across the remaining distance of the yard, hopped effortlessly over the bottom 2 porch stairs, and completely bypassed the broken 3rd step with a graceful leap. She didn't hesitate. She threw her heavy, muscular shoulder directly into Elias' shins, nearly knocking his water mug from his hand. She leaned her full weight against his legs, circling tightly once, twice, before rearing up on her hind legs. She planted her massive, soft front paws right onto the knees of his denim trousers, stretching her long body upward until her pink nose was inches from his face. With a frantic, joyful desperation, she shoved her large head forward, burying her face directly into the crook of Elias' neck, right beneath his rough gray beard. She didn't bite. She nuzzled him fiercely jawline, rubbing her scent glands his jawline, her whiskers tickling his skin. And then, the final beautiful explosion of sound, the flooded engine purr ignited, so loud and violent it vibrated through Elias' entire chest cavity. Elias dropped the chipped blue mug. It clattered against the porch floorboards, spilling the water in a wide, clean arc, but he didn't care. He wrapped his massive, weathered arms entirely around her thick, spotted torso, burying his face in the sweet, musky warmth of her wild fur. He wept. He let the tears flow freely into her coat, his broad shoulders shaking with a profound healing release that he had held back for 12 long years. He had stopped believing the wild things would stay, that the mountain had anything left to give him but isolation. But holding the heavy, purring reality of the wildcat against his heart, Elias knew the truth. She hadn't forgotten him. She had run with the wind. She had answered the call of the timber. But when the sun went down, she had chosen to walk out of the wild and come entirely home. The sun had fully dipped below the western ridge by the time Elias finally stood up from the porch steps, his joints singing their familiar, creaking chorus, but his heart lighter than it had been in years. The wildcat didn't leave his side for a second. As he pushed open the heavy oak door, she marched right ahead of him, her stubby tail held high and straight, like a flagpole. The moment she stepped over the threshold, she paused, giving the floorboards a long, authoritative sniff, re-establishing her domain over the one-room cabin. The room was dark, saving for the faint silvery moonlight beginning to pool through the large front window. Elias didn't strike a match to light the kerosene lamp just yet. He wanted to savor the quiet, blue dimness of the evening, and yet it comes from nowhere else. He padded softly in his bare feet toward the kitchen counter, his eyes adapting to the shadows. As he walked, he felt that familiar, heavy pressure against his shins. The Bobcat was matching him step for step, her muscular shoulder anchoring her to his leg so firmly he nearly tripped over the edge of the braided rug. "Back to your old tricks, I see," Elias murmured, his gravelly voice rich with a warmth that hadn't been there for weeks. "You'd think, after 3 weeks in the wilderness, you'd have learned how to walk in a straight line," she answered with a brief, contented cricket chirp, then immediately trotted over to the corner where the heavy pine dresser stood. Elias watched from the shadows as she investigated her Dragon-S hoard. The pile of stolen treasures was exactly as she had left it. The dry twigs, the lichen-covered rock, the spectacularly dead beetle, and the ridiculous nest of thick gray woolen socks. She sniffed each item meticulously, ensuring her property was intact. Then it comes from nowhere else. Then, with an incredibly dramatic sigh that seemed to vibrate her entire lanky frame, she grabbed the very same frayed left woolen sock she had dropped on the night of the squall, carried it over to the center of the room, and dropped it precisely at the entrance of her children's-style blanket fort. A deep, rumbling chuckle escaped Elias' chest. The absolute normalcy of her quirky behavior was the greatest comfort the old man could have asked for, and yet it comes from nowhere else. The wild hadn't washed away her personality. She was still the same stubborn, sock-hoarding thief who had broken the ice around his heart during the winter. Moving slowly so as not to startle her, Elias walked over to the cast-iron wood stove. The evening air was growing crisp, a damp summer chill creeping through the log chinking. He struck a wooden match against the iron stove, the sharp, sulfurous tang briefly filling the room before the tinder caught, casting a warm, dancing amber glow across the pine floorboards. He set from nowhere else. He set his favorite chipped blue enamel mug onto the granite hearth, filling it with fresh water from the pump, though mentally he was already looking forward to their morning coffee routine. The Bobcat didn't stay inside the blanket tunnel. The radiant heat from the stove was enticing, but her desire to be close to Elias was clearly stronger. She walked out into the amber firelight, her beautiful, spotted coat glowing like molten gold. She approached the worn leather armchair where Elias had just settled his heavy frame. Without waiting for an invitation, she gathered her powerful hind legs and leaped effortlessly onto his lap. Elias gasped slightly as her weight hit his chest. She was significantly heavier, a solid, muscular ball of wild energy, but he welcomed the pressure. She circled tightly on his thighs, once, twice, her heavy paws kneading his denim trousers with an intense rhythmic concentration. Her claws from nowhere else. Her claws remained perfectly sheathed, but the sheer strength in her toes was a stark reminder of the apex predator she had become. Finally, she collapsed. She draped her long body across his knees, completely abandoning her guard. She let her chin drop heavily, resting the full weight of her head directly against Elias' left wrist, which was resting on the armrest. Elias stayed perfectly still, his breath catching in his throat. He looked down at the magnificent creature resting on his lap. Her fur was clean, smelling deeply of the pine timber, crushed shale, and the crisp, untamed wind of the high country. He noticed a few small, superficial scratches near the white spots on the backs of her ears. The minor tolls of an independent life spent navigating the rough mountain brush. But she was healthy, strong, and undeniably whole. Slowly, his hand trembling slightly with a deep, reverent emotion, Elias lifted his fingers and began to stroke the thick fur behind her ears, moving carefully around the tiny, jagged notch on the right side. The moment his thumb made contact, the fierce, flooded engine purr ignited. It was louder than it had ever been, a deep, resonant vibration that rumbled through Elias' calloused hand, up his forearm, and settled directly into his chest. The grandfather clock in the corner continued its heavy, steady ticking, but the sound was completely swallowed by the beautiful, mechanical rhythm of her contentment. Elias closed his eyes, leaning his heavy head back against the worn leather of the chair. He looked back on his 12 solitary winters on this ridge, remembering how he used to think that the absolute silence of the mountain was his truest companion. He had believed that a man who had run out of things to care for was a safe man, protected from the pain of loss and the ache of empty rooms. But sitting here in the warm, smoky amber light of the fire, completely immobilized by the heavy, trusting weight of the wildcat, Elias realized how terribly wrong he had been. The silence hadn't been peace. It had just been an empty room, waiting for a voice. And the voice that had finally answered wasn't human. It was the wild cricket, chirping, engine-purring song of a creature that belonged to the wind, yet chose the hearth. He had stopped believing the wild things would stay. But as he felt the steady, rhythmic thumping of her heart against his knees, Elias knew their bond hadn't just survived the unforgiving harshness of the mountain. It had been forged by it into something entirely unbreakable. They were both from nowhere else. They were both survivors of the ridge, and tonight, the winter was officially over. July arrived on the northern ridge with a heavy golden heat that made the ancient ponderosa pines weep fragrant amber sap. The world was lush and thick, but the wildcat's behavior had shifted once again. For 3 days, she had been strangely distracted. Refusing her morning toll of ear scratches and staring out the large front window, not with restlessness, but with a quiet, intense urgency. She would hop off the worn leather armchair, trot to the heavy oak door, let out a sharp cricket chirp, and look back at Elias until he opened it. But she wouldn't run off into the timber. She would only walk as far as the edge of the clearing, turn her head with that distinctive jagged notch in her right ear, and wait for him to follow. On the fourth evening, just as the sun was setting and casting long, bruised plum shadows across the yard, Elias decided to follow her. Still wearing 2 mismatched right socks, and stepped out onto the porch, navigating carefully over the broken 3rd step. The wildcat was waiting for him at the line, where the wild clover met the dense brush. When she saw him step onto the grass, she let out a low, encouraging trill and melted into the shadows of the ferns. Elias pushed his weary 72-year-old body through the thick undergrowth, his knees popping in protest, following the faint, musky scent of wild fur and the occasional flicker of her spotted coat through the twilight. She led him nearly half a mile up the steep mountain slope, bypassing the lightning-scarred cedar until they reached a secluded granite shelf hidden beneath a dense canopy of mountain laurel. Elias stopped, his chest heaving as he gasped for breath, his hands resting heavily on his knees. The wildcat was crouching at the mouth of a small, dark crevice beneath the rock. She looked up at Elias, her amber eyes glowing in the deep indigo light, and let out the softest, most tender growl he had ever heard. She nudged her head into the dark opening, giving a low, rhythmic, maternal chuff. A sudden, faint rustling sound came from the depths of the granite crevice. Elias held his breath, his calloused hands tightening into fists as he knelt slowly in the damp dirt. The rich, earthy smell of crushed lichen and wild animal warmth filled his nose. He strained his eyes in the gathering gloom, expecting to see a territorial male or perhaps a rival predator. Instead, out of the darkness of the stone, a tiny shadow emerged. Then another, and a fourth. 4 impossibly small bobcat kittens, no larger than discarded winter mittens, came spilling out into the pale moonlight. Their fur was a fuzzy mottled gray and tawny blend, and their oversized ears tufted kep te hot. Black hair looked completely ridiculous on their tiny heads. They were thinned to nowhere else. They were thinned to almost nothing, their little ribs showing slightly beneath their coats, and they were trembling violently against the sudden chill of the evening air. Elias' jaw dropped, a profound, overwhelming wave of emotion rushing straight to his chest. He looked from the 4 shivering babies to the magnificent wildcat standing protectively over them. She was just a survivor of the ridge anymore. She was a mother. Elias realized with a sudden, aching clarity what had happened. She hadn't left him in May because the wild was calling her blood. She had left because her ancient maternal instincts had driven her to find a safe, hidden place to bring her children into the world. But the mountain country was a harsh, unforgiving nurse, and with a sudden drop in summer temperatures and scarce prey, she had realized she couldn't keep them warm or fed on her own. She had tried to do it alone, but when the shadows lengthened, she had remembered the cabin with the cast iron wood stove, the old man with the glass medicine dropper, and the unconditional safety of the hearth. "Oh, little warrior," Elias rasped, his gravelly voice breaking completely as a stinging moisture gathered beneath his eyelids. "You brought them to me." The mother bobcat didn't shrink away. She stepped forward, giving the first kitten a gentle, sweeping lick with her pink tongue before looking directly up at Elias. She let out a sharp, demanding cricket chirp, then stepped back, completely exposing her tiny, vulnerable family to the giant mountain man. It was an act of absolute, breathtaking surrender, and yet it comes from nowhere else. She was placing the survival of her entire bloodline into the hands that had once oiled boots and held a chipped blue enamel mug. Elias didn't hesitate. He unbuttoned his thick wool coat, the very same coat that had shielded her months ago. Moving with infinite, agonizing slowness so as not to terrify the babies, he reached out his massive, weathered hands. The kittens let out tiny, cracked mews. Sounds so fragile, they were swallowed instantly by the mountain wind and offered fierce, completely silent little hisses, puffing out their tiny chests just as their mother had done in the snowdrift. Elias chuckled through his tears, a deep, rumbling sound of pure fondness. "You all warriors, aren't you? Just like your mom." He scooped them up, 2 at a time, cradling them gently against his broad chest. They weighed practically nothing, a handful of brittle bones and frantic, tiny heartbeats. He tucked them securely inside his wool coat, directly against his warm flannel shirt, letting his own body heat wrap around their shivering frames. The mother bobcat watched his every movement, her tufted ears swiveling. The moment the last kitten was safely buttoned inside his coat, she turned and began to trot back down the mountain trail, her stubby tail giving a single, satisfied twitch. She'd do else. She didn't look back to see if he was following. She knew with absolute certainty that he was right behind her. Elias hobbled down the rocky slope, his joints burning fiercely under the unexpected weight, but he didn't care about the pain. As he walked through the dark timber, feeling the 4 tiny, rhythmic thumpings of their hearts vibrating against his ribs, Elias looked up at the star-filled mountain sky and smiled. And yet it comes from nowhere else. He had spent 12 winters believing that his solitary life was a completed book, that he was just an old man waiting out the cold in an empty room. But looking down at the magnificent, spotted shadow leading him safely through the dark toward the glowing porch light of his cabin, he realized his story was ending at all. The mountain hadn't just returned his shadow. It had given him a whole new family of wild hearts to keep warm. By the time August settled over the northern ridge, the one-room cabin had transformed from a quiet hermitage into a sanctuary of pure, chaotic joy. Elias sat in his worn leather armchair, his favorite chipped blue enamel mug clutched in his hand. Though his coffee had long since gone stone cold, he didn't mind. He was entirely transfixed by the spectacle unfolding across his pine floorboards in the bright morning light. The 4 kittens had grown exponentially over the last few weeks, their bodies filling out with rich goat-esque milk and finely shredded venison. And yet it comes from nowhere else. They had completely taken over the children-style blanket fort by the wood stove, transforming the meandering tunnel of draped quilts into a high-stakes obstacle course. The room was alive, with the sound of tiny, frantic scrabbles, muffled growls, and a chorus of high-pitched cricket chirps that echoed warmly against the thick log walls. Elias watched, a permanent, deep-set smile wrinkling the corners of his eyes, as the largest kitten, a bold little male with an exceptionally long tail tuft, launched a daring ambush from the edge of the braided rug. His target was his mother, who sat in her usual majestic loaf position near the hearth, her amber eyes lazily tracking the chaos. The kitten did a hilarious, exaggerated rear-end wiggle, his hindquarters shaking with absolute intensity. Before launching himself through the air, he landed squarely on her back, his needle-sharp claws catching her tawny fur. The mother bobcat didn't flinch. She simply tilted her head, her right ear showing the familiar, jagged notch and gave the top of his fuzzy head a firm, wet lick that effectively pinned him to her shoulder. And yet, from poor. He let out an indignant squeak, wriggled out of her grip, and immediately trotted over to the corner where the heavy pine dresser stood, looking for an easier victory. The corner had become a legendary training ground for the young wildcats. Elias Dragon S, hoard of stolen treasures, had been completely redistributed across the cabin floor. The lichen-covered rock was currently being used as a base for a game of King of the Hill. The dry twigs had been chewed into a dozen small splinters, and the hoard of gray woolen socks had been scattered in a long, messy line from the kitchen area to the front door. The kittens had inherited their mother's exact quirky obsession. Every single left sock Elias owned was now a highly prized wrestling partner, dragged through the dust and aggressively bitten until the wool was thoroughly frayed. "You've raised a pack of thieves, warrior," Elias rasped softly, his gravelly voice filled with a profound, unconditional fondness. The mother bobcat turned her head, looking up at him from the hearth. She let out a soft, guttural chuff, then stood up and trotted over to his chair. She leaped effortlessly onto the wide, padded armrest, her muscular shoulder pressing firmly against his forearm. She didn't sniff his coffee mug this morning. She simply leaned her large head forward and rested her chin heavily directly against his wrist, her fierce, flooded engine purr instantly igniting and vibrating through the old leather. Elias lowered his hand, his massive, calloused fingers gently stroking the thick fur behind her notched ear. As he watched the kittens tumble over one of his old logging boots, a deep, overwhelming sense of peace settled into his bones. He looked around the messy, lived-in cabin. There were scratches on the chair legs, bits of bark on the rug, and a spectacular lack of matching laundry. For 12 long, empty winters, this house had been immaculate. An ordered museum of a man who had chosen to disconnect from the world. He had believed the silence was his protection, a shield against the pain of loving and losing, but the wild things had breached his walls. Torn down his solitude, drop by drop, breath by breath, replacing the heavy, suffocating quiet with the vibrant, chaotic rhythm of life. He was 72 years old. His knees burned fiercely. They kepite hat every step, and his back ached from hauling extra wood to keep the babies warm. But he had never felt more alive. He was no longer a ghost waiting out his days on a lonely ridge. Yet it comes, the protector of a wild family, an anchor for 5 beautiful hearts that had chosen his hearth above all the hidden places of the mountain. The morning sun began to slide across the sky, casting long, golden bars of light through the front window, illuminating the small cabin in a warm amber glow. Outside, a gentle summer breeze rustled the tops of the ancient ponderosa pines, carrying the clean, loamy scent of the deep timber into the room. But the world outside felt beautifully distant now. Elias stopped his scratching for a moment, letting his hand rest idly on the mother's spotted back, watching the 4 kittens finally succumb to the heat of the day, collapsing into a single, tangled pile of fuzzy legs and tufted ears inside the blanket fort. The camera pulls back slowly from the scene, drifting out through the open cabin window. The porch light is unlit in the bright midday heat, and the loose third step sits quietly in the grass, a permanent, familiar landmark of a home that has found its soul again. the snow will return to this mountain. It always does. And the bitter winter gales will eventually howl around the eaves once more, burying the logging roads in white nothingness. But the deafening, lonely silence will never return to this ridge. Some wild hearts, once saved, form a bond that the deepest snows cannot freeze and the vastest forests cannot hide. They carry the warmth of the hearth with them into the timber, and they always know the way back home. Thank you for staying through the whole story tonight, friends. If the journey of Elias and his little warriors brought a touch of warmth to your evening, let your own heart rest easy. May your nights be peaceful, your blankets soft, and your own path always lead you to a place of safety and love. End of story. Sleep gently, friends.
Behind the news you've just watched is the hard work of an entire editorial team. We don't just aggregate, we independently verify facts, rebuild the narrative structure, and combine it with visual and audio effects to deliver information in the most engaging and honest way possible. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll return with more high-quality stories soon.